When talking about research, and we're going to get to the research circle, the first part of it is theory. So theory often drives research, not always, but often. And so I wanted to sort of start off with theory in terms of like, well, what's the point of theory at all? So first of all, the point is we want to explain or understand something. So we use theory to figure out, why some people commit crimes and why other people don't, why some people are more likely to be victims and others are not. How does programming affect recidivism? So things like that. So we want to use theory to explain something and also to better understand it. Theory is also very helpful when we want to make predictions. So, for example, will crimes be more violent at night or during the day? So there are theories that would say that, crime is much more likely to happen at night, and also it's much more likely to be more dangerous and more violent at night. There are theories to explain that and to explain why. And so they help us to figure out that if we're going to test something like that, our prediction should be that crime is going to be more violent at night, because that is what the theory would suggest. Or, will crime drop in an area of a park if a streetlight is put in? So there are situational theories that, would say, yeah, it would. So let's test that. So theory helps us to make predictions like that. Theories also help us to organize and make sense of findings after the fact. So, we come up with things and we see what's happening with data, what our subjects said or whatever. And theory helps us to organize that and look at the patterns and figure out what they mean. So, for example, routine activities theory would help to explain why police patrols have led to a decrease in crime in a certain area. And it's so because routine activities is about situational factors, and guardianship is a big part of that. And so police patrols increases guardianship, which decreases opportunities. So if we saw that increased police patrols led to a decrease in crime, routine activities theory would explain why that happened. So theory can also guide future research. It really helps us to develop questions from research. And so, we conduct research, and then no one research project can answer it all. We know that. So theory kind of helps to guide where we want to go based on what we know, based on what we want to know. Theory helps to kind of guide us, and sort of that ties back into making predictions in terms of, well, if we think this is going to happen, well, let's go test it and see if it's true. And then, of course, theory also guides policy, because we want to know things like, well, how should police resources be used? And we don't have an unlimited supply of resources and manpower, so we want to be able to use those resources effectively. Is it worth giving offenders in prison and education? The theory says, yes, it absolutely is. And so research has supported that. And so then that will guide specific policies about providing educational opportunities to those that are incarcerated. So when we're looking at social research strategies, there's two kind of main types, two ways you can go about it. And the first is through deductive reasoning. And so deductive reasoning very much uses that theory to drive sort of what's going on and what's happening. So it's very theory driven. And so it's kind of a top-down approach is kind of how you think of it. So it moves from the very general ideas at the top. So the theories, the overall patterns, this is related to this, and so this very specific reality, the specific data. And so it uses hypotheses then to test theories. And so this is often, the way when we think of, back in grade school when we did our science projects, we would come up with an hypothesis and then you test the hypothesis. That's deductive reasoning. And because your hypothesis is going to come from theory. Theory is going to tell you, and previous research, theory and previous research are going to tell you what you expect to happen, which becomes your hypothesis, which you then if your hypothesis is true, that supports the theory. So that's how kind of deductive reasoning works, is we have these general principles, we come up with an hypothesis, and then we see if that hypothesis is true with our specific information. And of course, we have I had to go back because I like this deductive reasoning. So this is a Star Trek example. So Kirk says, well, can we exploit their religion, Spock? Wearing those meters, they must be bishops. And Spock says, your logic is unsound, Jim. Did you see even one of them move diagonally? So he's using reasoning and he's using deductive reasoning, but obviously he's a little bit flawed because Spock doesn't always understand the social world. So the other type is inductive reasoning. So you have deductive reasoning is the top-down approach. Inductive reasoning is the opposite. It's the bottom-up approach. So it's, instead of using theory, it's essentially what creates theory, what generates theory. And so it moves from the very specific to the general. So it goes in that opposite direction. So we start with information to then generate very general principles. So this is an example, this little comic is an example of inductive reasoning kind of failing, where he says, I exist, I am human, my pencil sharpener exists, my pencil sharpener is human. So inductive reasoning starts with, we see information, we see something happening. So, we notice that there's a pattern, or, we see crime is up in a certain area, or we see, that these certain types of offenders are suddenly really, their recidivism risk has gone way down. What caused that? So we start with what we see. We start with a pattern that we notice, and then we try to sort of generalize that and sort of like, well, what's overall is happening with these offenders? And then let's move into, well, what theory can explain that? And sometimes it sort of ends up being support for a theory that already exists, but this is also how theories are created in the first place. So then this is the research circle. So we have deductive reasoning from the top down on that, on this sort of kind of little arrow. Here we have the deductive reasoning, and then the inductive reasoning is from the bottom up. So the deductive reasoning, we start with theory, we create an hypothesis, and then we test it with data. Inductive research starts at the bottom here with the data, and we sort of use descriptive research to describe what's going on in sort of a little bit more not quite generalized terms, but we want to kind of see what's happening. And then we come up with some empirical generalizations, which really is just about things like, well, if an offender is in prison for less than 5 years, his recidivism risk is low, and more than 5 years, it tends to be higher. Or something like that. And I just made that up. But that would be an empirical generalization, which then would go up to the theory that maybe says longer prison terms are not actually effective. And so we need to come up with other ways instead of just throwing people in prison for forever. And so that would kind of create some kind of theory from that. And then it kind of is a circle, because then you would take that and say, well, let's test that with an hypothesis that comes from that and test it with different data and see if it still holds up. And then you kind of just continue in the circle. So, a theory then is any logically interrelated set of propositions about reality. And so we think of theories, you kind of probably, if you've taken like a intro to criminology class, you will think of like the big theories, like routine activities theory and rational choice theory and social disorganization theory, and like the big ones, strain theory, enemy, like those are all theories, and they absolutely are theories. But a theory doesn't have to be that big and well known to be considered a theory. It's really any kind of set of things that are true, and they kind of all go together, and you can explain them all based on the way that you're going to explain it based on what's happening in the world, and based on previous research, and based on other theories. So the kind of big theories that we think about, those are all absolutely theories, but it doesn't have to be that big and that well known to still be considered a theory. And then an hypothesis is a tentative statement which usually uses theory to create sort of what you think is going to happen. And it's about a relationship between two or more variables. So you think, as this goes up, this one goes up, or as this goes up, this goes down, or whatever the relationship is that you think is going to happen. And so that hypothesis comes from theory. And then a constant is literally something that doesn't vary. It takes on one value within the sample that you have, or the population that you have, and it's a constant. It's usually something that's kind of used to just describe your sample or your population. So it'd be something like, if I am doing research and my sample consists entirely of MSU Northern students, then a constant would be that all of the people in my sample are students, they're undergrads, they're going to MSU Northern, they're whatever else. So those would be constants, because it's the same for everybody. And it's really just kind of ways to describe the people in your sample or in your population if you're talking larger. So a variable then is the opposite of a constant in the sense that it is a characteristic that varies instead of one that stays the same. So you have two main variables. You have your independent variable and your dependent variable. So your independent variable is a variable that is independent. It doesn't depend on anything else. It has an effect on something else, or at least an hypothesized effect. But it's not affected by other variables, at least not any other variables in your research study. It's the one having the effect. Whereas the dependent variable is the variable that depends on something else, or it's influenced by your independent variable. So the independent variable then influences change in the dependent variable. And so the dependent variable is typically the one that you're actually like really most interested in explaining. It's kind of the whole point of why you're doing your research study in the first place, usually. So it'd be things like if we want to see the effects of a certain program in prison, a prison program for inmates on their recidivism rates. The dependent variable is the recidivism rate. That's what you're really interested in. That's the whole point. You're trying to reduce recidivism rates. And so if then we're going to test the effect of this program, say an anger management program, for example, then that program is the independent variable. Whether they take that program or not is the independent variable, and then it is going to have an effect on their likelihood of recidivism or not. That's what you're testing. So the independent variable is the one that is having an effect on the thing that is what you're actually the outcome variable, the one you're most interested in. So another thing that's kind of important is the direction of association. And so this is, you can have, when you have two variables, they can be related in a positive way. A positive relationship means the independent variable and dependent variable are moving in the same direction. This is what this looks like. So as x goes up, y goes up. So they're going in that positive direction. So as, as social disorganization goes up, crime goes up. So, you look in areas that have elements of social disorganization, so things like poverty and people moving in and out and things like that, and diversity. Then as that goes up, then crime goes up. That would be a positive correlation. Whereas a negative relationship is the opposite. As the independent variable goes up, the dependent variable goes down. So this is what it looks like. So as x goes up, y goes down. So it's moving in this opposite relationship. And so this would be something like as age increases, likelihood of recidivism goes down, because we know that people age out of crime. So that would be a negative relationship. And the thing you have to remember about this is if we're looking at a positive relationship, you could say as x goes up, y goes up, but you could also say as x goes down, y goes down, and that is the same relationship. Similarly, you can say as x goes up, y goes down, but as x goes down, y goes up. That is the same relationship. You can say it either way. So you can either say as age increases, crime decreases, or you can say younger people have higher likelihoods of criminality. That's the same relationship. So data then is really, I've kind of thrown that word around a bunch, but it's just, it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, so it can be words, it can be numbers, or it can be some kind of combination of the two. And often the combination is the best way to get the most out of your research study, but not always. There's lots of research that's purely qualitative, there's lots that's purely quantitative, and there's lots that do both. Mixed methods is what that's called. So empirical generalizations then are basically your findings from whatever study you have done. And so you've got your data and you come up with your generalizations that are basically your patterns that you see in your data. So the data is all just a bunch of numbers, let's say, if it's quantitative, and you can see patterns, and maybe you have something like this when you plot it on a chart, but then your empirical generalization would be this line. It would be as x goes up, y goes up. That's your empirical generalization, taking into account all your data and then coming up with the patterns. And that is the research circle.